So welcome to today's webinar, Global Construction Costs. Have we reached the peak? We're glad everyone could make it out today. I'm Marlon, Senior Director of our Cost and Project Management Group out in Canada, and today's moderator and occasional contributor. After all, I don't need to be asked twice for an opinion. Today I'm joined by Faris out of our US office, Director in Cost Management also, and we have Niall down under in APAC, who's the President of APAC Cost Consulting. So I also want to say a big shout out to the support crew. So we got Aussie Kate, Canuck Kate, the man from Texas, Johannes himself, Kat and Elizabeth, all keeping in charge of us to try and make sure we don't get any trouble. So today we're going to be sharing our perspectives on construction costs in all of our respective regions and the UK and Europe. So a global perspective. So before we jump in, a couple of housekeeping items. We will be emailing out a link to a recording of today's presentation after the webinar. Thank you for those who submitted your questions when you registered. We'll be answering a few of those at the end of today's webinar, and any we don't get to, we'll be sure to get back to you personally. If you don't get a chance to submit a question during registration, you can still submit today in the chat, and we'll try and get back to you. So the global construction industry is basically truly massive, and it's growing to meet the needs of an ever-increasing population. It is modernizing very slowly to reflect changes such as global warming with ESG or housing the large shift to urban centers that we've seen over the last 40, 50 years, which will likely continue for the foreseeable future. The market as it stands in 2021 was about 7.3 trillion US dollars globally, and the expectation is by 2023 that market size is going to double in size. So as we come out of the pandemic, it's been a roller coaster to say the least. Construction escalation has been somewhat of a global challenge, with different degrees of pain depending on the location. And as we stand today, the world is having a couple different degrees of separation, but somewhat interconnected and influencing each other. The Western world continues to have massive labor shortages. In general, interest rates are killing the market from country to country and having different impacts depending on which country you're in. The other is, as one asset slows, another increases. As one country grinds down, another rises from the ashes. And we can predict a boom is coming in countries with high immigration, such as Australia and Canada. But there are also housing affordability challenges in the UK, in the US, across Europe, as well as these higher immigration countries. While interest rates tamper this down, it's a false hope that will rear its ugly head again. The number of issues we face globally are unprecedented, with global disruption, protectionism driving out of the pandemic, and the war in Ukraine, amongst other world conflicts. So while we could go on for an hour and a half just doing the introduction, we only have an hour to cover the entire globe, so let's get started. So first question. Start things off. I think it'd be best if each of us could give a quick breakdown of what we've seen in our region. So why don't we start with you now?
Thanks, Marlon. A lot of interesting things. As you touched on there, there's a range of different issues that are occurring across the globe, and they're all interrelated. When we've seen in 2021, the issues in regards to transportation and the flow and effect that had for costs, we all thought this was actually a very strange phenomenon, and this was something that was actually going to perpetuate. However, what we have seen is that the post-pandemic return to pre-pandemic rates of the likes of shipping really sort of even things out a little bit in regards to how the actual supply chains have sort of come back to full operation. Notwithstanding all that, one of the key things is that we are seeing, as you said, issues in regards to labor shortage and inflation, which is a global issue, really starting to fire in and kick in on a range of costs and influencing what's happening in regards to our escalation rates. So Australia lagging a little bit behind the rest of the world, thankfully, in regards to its inflation rate peaking at just over 8% and starting to ease off. It didn't get into the double digits like Europe, but equally they're also starting to back off. We are finding that in Australia, escalation is still one of those big issues. In the rest of Europe, in the rest of Asia, it is a mixed bag depending on which particular state you're in. So from the lower levels of activity in the likes of China, from the forced lockdowns, and the slowdown, particularly in the residential sector, is sort of keeping costs under control, to in Europe, where basic labor shortages is causing escalation jumping into the teens, depending on which particular section you're in. Inflation, again, is reflected across that, and particularly in Europe, where you can see ranges of inflation in some of the bigger economies of the likes of Italy, Germany, and the UK, either between 8 and 10%, and a European average of about 10%. Whereas in other particular sectors, or particular smaller economies, the likes of Ireland, where escalation is running into double digits. Lots of this will actually start to back off. However, there still is always that spectre of what's next, and where do we actually see particular spikes in the industry. As you touched on, particular sectors are becoming hotter, and as you mentioned, Canada and Australia both have aggressive policies in relation to migration, with the current government increasing the migration intake by about 25%. The only thing that I will say that's tempering that is just the bureaucracy and the length of time that it is actually taking to actually get through that, with an effort to actually see an improvement in the skills shortages, not only in the construction sector, but across the whole lot of the economy. Looking forward, what does that actually mean for us all? We're seeing that prices in the construction industry, in particular sectors, are moderating. They're not going down. They are moderating to actually more normal rates of escalation, but particular sectors that have unattractive levels of risk causing escalation in those particular areas to rise even further.
So Faris, do you want to give the US impression? I really like the painting you've got behind you. It's much more imaginative than myself and Niall. But if you want to jump in for us, the US opinion?
Absolutely. So US obviously is not insulated from the overall effects of the world, as Niall had mentioned, and you pretty much captured in the beginning too. So we are looking at pre-pandemic and post-pandemic scenarios right now, and in between, what happened in between as well. So I'll move forward from those general macroeconomic trends, and obviously the Fed interest rates policy and inflation continues to weigh down on the construction sector well into the 2023 right now as we speak. The biggest impact that we had seen, and some sort of slowdown or some sort of cautious approach by most developers and industry at large as well, has been the Fed rates, which have been increased probably 6 times in 2022 to its highest level since 2008 as well. And they have pointed to further continued hikes as well, which will hamper, or definitely it will hamper the overall progression as we had seen, and the robustness as we had seen in the industry in the past couple of years. But the demand and supply side is pointing towards a totally different scenario compared to what the regressive Fed policy is doing to us, because the job market is robust, the employment numbers are still high, which they want to tame down, but would it happen or not, we don't know. We will see. But inflation has been contained per se. The trend is definitely pointing downwards. We saw the highs of over 7%, and now we're down to 6.4% per se in US, as is being projected right now. And it's projected to go down as we speak. So then again, couple that with the major governmental legislations, which had happened in the past 2 years or year or two, and some of the policies of the previous government had a positive impact, which will somehow mitigate these effects as we are seeing globally, and which has impacted the market in general and the construction. But however, the supply side is not keeping up with the demand side, particularly in the housing side, and we continue to see those shortages in the housing sector, which definitely takes up most of the spending when it comes to the construction spending. Like the US market is, Niall had mentioned, approximately a couple of $1 trillion of the global market. So US market is approximately close to $1.7 trillion construction segment, residential being one of the bigger one, and the non-residential and infrastructure being the one that is going to be the next one to follow. So volatility is an unpredictable yearly look ahead is obviously that is across all segments, all regions, I'd say. One thing I would like to point out, not just the from North American perspective, but the Americas as well. Just looking at some of the South American market and the Caribbean, which we cover somehow as a consulting service entity. So those markets have been equally hit as well. But the bright spot is presently Mexico. And looking at the overall Caribbean hospitality industry, it is slow, but Mexico and Brazil, those are the two countries that stand out in the region as well, along with looking at the overall region, which we don't want to miss all the regions as we are speaking. That's my take so far.
Perfect. Well, I'll take the smallest region now, which is Canada. So you guys both take these huge regions. I get the little baby one now at the end. But I think in Canada, the best way to summarize it is I call it the hangover year this year. Developers, owners, government, contractors, they've all had PTSD after the absolute insanity we've been through since 2017. So we're expecting a slowdown this year into next year. Then 2025, the gloves come off again, we start have the major issues, and the housing shortage is the thing that's going to drive the majority of where the market's heading, as well as massive infrastructure spend. So similar to what you gents were saying, inflation seems to be under control. The central bank yesterday came out and actually didn't increase interest rates for the first time since last year and held pat. There's a few people nervous about that, but I think generally it's the right thing to do. So I think the Canadian view is not dissimilar. And I think it goes back to the introduction where I think everyone's just in different points of the cycle, feeling similar amounts of pain. And thank you for picking up South America as well, Faris. So when we start to look at development costs, or we look at building costs, or we look at overall project costs, there's hard costs, so construction costs, on-site costs, all of the fun stuff that we're involved in every day today. And then in Canada, it's called the soft cost side, but that's municipal charges, impact fees, financing, marketing, stuff like that. So I know the nomenclature does change, but what's having the biggest impact in your regions that you see right now? Do you expect the balance to change over the next 6 months to the year? As now went first, last time, why wouldn't you throw it to you, Faris, to go up?
Absolutely. So one positive thing is from the US side is that the pipeline, the projects that are in the pipeline, the one that are under construction, and also the associated contractors and builders forecast, which they have projected like over 9 months of work in the pipeline. This is the projected work, not just the one that are under construction right now. So yes, we started off on a very solid footing pre-pandemic, and we continued that pace. And right now, going into 2023, we are seeing those starts to be completed, because the 1 year, 2 year cycle, give or take, so one or 2 year cycles in 2021 and 2022, we kept that pace. For 2023, those large amount of those projects, residential including, will come on board, and then likely they're going to continue to the 2023. So the overall negativity that has been caused due to the inflationary pressure and discretionary spending per se, and the overall spending and purchasing power, which likely impacts most the construction of the residential sector more than others. However, it's an issue too. So that will be picked up by the non-residential construction going forward, as per the projections. So yes, you have to be cautiously optimistic. So work is not an issue. Demand is there, as I said in the beginning. I mean, it's all about demand and supply too. So demand is there. The new changes that are happening within the green economy per se, which is a big thing right now, is being pushed by the government too. So that is having a positive impact. Infrastructure spending, which is non-residential aspect, which is a significant outlay. And those projects will be happening throughout the country. Yes, some of the skills might not be transferable to those projects, as we know, because those are more specialized projects. So yes, labor shortages is a big issue too, that we are seeing across the board, and the construction industry will definitely have to deal with that as it comes. But the overall sentiment is towards like, I'd say, controlled chaos. This is how I'd put it.
Perfect. So Faris touched on what he's seen in terms of hard costs, and then the other side, soft costs, as I call them, or project costs, having a big impact. What are you sort of seeing, Niall, in terms of where that cost balance is in terms of the pressures coming from?
It's a lot of it is sector specific. The push in relation to the green construction side of things is definitely there in the commercial sectors, where there is a desire from institutional investors in regards to improving what the new products are in coming into market. In the soft costs, one of the big things is in relation to debt. There is a lot of money out there, and there's a lot of money available. However, the cost of the money is actually rising, and the appetite for risk is shifting a little bit. As a result of that, and also some legislative enactments in relation to what charges and fees are, there are other pressures coming into the overall development in the private sector. Public sector, I think governments have basically still gone down the road of in a large proportion of the regions with a strong drive in infrastructure, particularly in social infrastructure, that is still fueling a lot in regards to activity within the industry, which can actually have a bit of an issue in regards to another inflationary pressure. But the pipeline is still very strong in most regions, that there is a lot of demand still there, surprisingly in some sectors. And we are still seeing that there is a good opportunity of growth across most sectors, leaving the residential to one side, because residential is definitely driven in relation to what the actual population growth is going to be. And as we touched on earlier on, for the Australian market, it is a big issue. But we're also seeing housing affordability being a major issue throughout Europe, and particularly some hotspots of the likes of the UK and Ireland, as well as what we actually are experiencing here within Australia, where house prices was anticipated to fall quite dramatically, hasn't really occurred. But yet the issues in relation to pre-commitment on starting on of that and off the plan sales have fallen away, which leads to an opportunity for institutional investors, particularly in the larger residential and what you would call multifamily, we would call build to rent sector, is actually really sort of coming on quite strongly. What does this actually do for the hard and the soft costs? The hard costs are creeping along. To control them, I do think one of the key issues is going to be about an acceptable level of risk sharing between the developers and the delivery partners. On the soft cost side of things, finance is still looming large, as is additional government fees, charges, and utility providers' fees and charges. Those are still creeping along and haven't really gotten themselves under control as yet. So there's a little bit of risk still on the horizon in both sides of the hard and the soft side of the delivery model.
Yeah, and I suppose the Canadian view is more recently, as construction costs have mitigated, unfortunately, the municipalities haven't figured out that solving housing affordability, if you keep increasing your fees over and over again each year, it actually has a negative impact. And then there's a time aspect in that. I usually make the joke that Toronto's the worst place on the planet to actually do business for approvals. The length of time here is just borders on the ridiculous. And I think between those two factors, we're now moving into a period where the soft costs have really caused significant challenges on purpose-built rental, as you guys call it, built to rent. And then the condo market is just that sales appetite because the interest rates is just dropping off, which sort of segues slightly into the next question in that here in Canada, we're starting to get a period of cost stabilization. A lot of that relates to inflation, interest rates, and housing affordability. Demand for the housing has slipped a little bit because it's not affordable. Are your regions experiencing that? If so, similar sort of regions or reasons, sorry? And I'll throw that over to you now first.
That's a really interesting question. We are seeing pockets of unaffordability, and what we have seen in particular post-pandemic, as people have realized that you do not always have to be on the ground in the exact point where you actually are dealing with particular issues, that there's a drive where people are moving to more affordable geos. So it may be in the sort of the secondary cities within a particular state, or it may be moving interstate. But we have noticed that the workforce is a little bit more mobile, and one of the big driving factors is housing affordability. The entry-level product is still very desirable, and there is a definite price point where you can see that there is still demand. Click over that price point and you can clearly see that the demand just falls away, which is driven heavily by the interest rates and the ability for actually just servicing of debt in regards to it. Similar sort of things have happened, and again, as you touched on earlier on, different parts of the cycle elsewhere in the world, up into Europe, and they've already experienced that, and that really came over the back of the global financial crisis across the previous 15 years, where affordability was an issue, and therefore the demand for housing, although very high, wasn't always going to be in the normal places because of cost. So I think what we are seeing is that yes, prices are stabilizing. Participation is an issue, and that comes in a little bit to do with some legislative changes, and particularly in the UK on the back of the Grenfell disaster and the combustibility of materials codes. Within Australia, it's around the actual surety of building quality, and that's also spreading out into the rest of the region, which has been a black spot for particularly the likes of Asia, where there has been dramatic failures in quality, and they're sort of one of the reasons why we're seeing that house pricing, in particular the apartment residential sector, the pricing is still probably escalating at a higher rate than the rest of the industry. It is stabilizing, but it's still higher than the rest of the industry in those areas, and that's common for all of those geos that I mentioned.
Yeah, Faris, do you want to take the Americas?
Yeah, as similar trends as we are seeing too, work from home concept. I mean, that technology sector in US had been at the forefront right before pandemic too. So affordability and the tech sector and the choices that it provided, particularly to the technology workers, was one of the starting points of this transition to a second moving away from the cities per se, and from the offices as well. So remote work had been in the works in the US for quite some time, not just since pandemic, but pandemic just like I'd say increased that, and it just put that whole issue in front of everyone. Like, well, you could continue to work from anywhere and still be productive as well. So we still are dealing with that. And what has it done to the regions here? Similar story that we had been hearing for last couple of years, in fact. So pandemic didn't had some impact, but it accelerated that process somewhat. So Northeast in US had been the population migration is one of the things that is happening inwards. So our immigration is as is. However, the local population and the demographics tend to decide where the bulk of the workforce is going to. So presently, the Northeast is the one that is on the losing end, and the South and California, North Carolina, and Georgia, those are the regions which have seen influx of new projects, population movements as well. So what has it done to the overall construction industry? Because obviously, multifamily plus your single family construction that has been robust in those regions, and the trends are pointing that that's going to be the trend going forward as well, not just in 2023, but even number of years from now on too. And obviously, affordability, less legislation in those states had been one of the factors, plus the job market as well. The new tech had been one of the drivers that had been driving people from other regions. Recently, the one interesting aspect that we had been debating in New York, particularly from a New York perspective and Miami perspective. So a lot of Wall Street banks are moving to Miami right now. And likewise, in coming years, that will be a trend that you will see, to have a Wall Street of the South per se. And those like all big names, they are opening up their offices up there in Florida area. So this trend is continuing, and the internal migration is in US is driven by the job market. Obviously, affordability is the second one. Are we building that $250,000 threshold house, a single family home? That is like can we get there? And that's the struggle for the developers. That's the catch for the people. However, the single family versus multifamily, I would consider that as two entities, separate entities, because US multifamily is more had been driven towards the rental market. It has been on the the owner from an ownership perspective, as you Mal mentioned in the Australian side, and I know the Canadian side, that is much more of a popular product. But that type of product, as you might see in Toronto or in Canada in general, could be considered as a luxury market here in US per se. So it's not an entry product. So entry products for those people are moving to wherever they can, and they're moving away from the cities. Secondary cities are seeing a lot of traction too. And the government is doing great in general on that end because of the infrastructure development. More money is being earmarked for those connectivity perspective because the roads, highways, bridges, and also the transit projects that are coming on board in all of these regions is pointing towards this trend that so we had the urban versus suburban. Now we have the secondary cities, which are again more popular, and somebody who could commute to the urban centers to deal with that. However, it has created another subset of problems of this hollowing of the offices spaces. But that's niche market. It's a secondary discussion, not our primary discussion right now. But those are the other trends, and which are kind of creating new industry, new opportunities of sorts as well for the construction industry in general.
No, that's a perfect segue. Other than I'd rather be in Miami right now than Toronto. It's a good segue, though, because we have hammered on the housing side of things a little bit and focused on that. But it's a great place to maybe talk about industrial, which obviously in Canada has gone completely crazy. You can't build it fast enough. And then office with work from home's having the opposite effect, i.e. no one wants to go to the office. So how are you guys seeing that in the various places around the world? I'm not sure, Niall, do you want to throw in a first opinion how you've seen it out in Europe and Asia?
Sure. Look, parts of it have been very interesting. During the pandemic, we were probably within Australia quite blessed in regards to the level of lockdown, albeit that I think most people in Melbourne would disagree with me in regards to that. But the likes of Perth never really got into a lockdown, so they never actually had a work away from office, and it's amazing that has. How the psyche there is where they basically have still stayed with face-to-face meetings in regards to it. Generally within Australia, the actual level of return to office has been quite high, and what we are seeing is that actually is becoming stronger and stronger. The industrial sector is a really interesting side of things, because that's one of the areas that has been a real shining star of growth, and I think that's the same around the world. When you actually look at the level of growth in online retail and what that actually means in relation to logistics, it's quite interesting. And we've a long way to catch up with the likes of Asia. Predominantly within Asia, there's countries that have up to 50% of retail sales are done online, and therefore it's a logistic issue in relation to getting particular products from the suppliers to the purchaser. But in Australia, we drop right the way down into sort of the 12, 13s of a rate of retail sales in relation to it. So there's a huge amount of growth potential within it. And Europe is somewhere in the middle. It's in the 20s, the 30s. So again, they're at a point where they're expanding that online sales in regards to retail, which is having an impact on retail centers in relation to it. But also in the industrial and logistics is probably one of those shining stars that we're going to see a lot of growth and a lot of further growth across that particular asset class, and in particular in the regions where it's just underweight. So it is quite interesting that, yes, we have hammered a lot about residential. It's a large part of it. but there's a huge amount of interest in some of these other sectors. And it's actually quite surprising the level of activity within the commercial sector, i.e. offices, is very, very high. And I think that's something Ferris touched on earlier on. There is a severe desire in relation to improving the sustainability of your particular assets and your asset classes and your actual building itself. That's fueling a lot of the development in relation to it, and new leases are looking for a lot of the greener credentials in regards to where people want to be. What that ultimately will do is create a ladder effect where everybody will move up one rung, and we will be left with a lot of the poorer quality, what we would call the B and C grade stock, is basically where the gap will be, and that will look to be repositioned in regards to. So there's a great potential in regards to those particular buildings going forward, but definitely there's a lot of activity still pent up, and a little bit to do with, again, where we talked about different parts of the world and different sectors in different places. But I do see the industrial as definitely one of those things that is common around the world.
Yeah, I know. It's going to stay in place. And then Faris, perhaps you can touch on industrial, but then when you get to office, I know when we were talking the other day, you had mentioned New York having the new rules about ESG, and I think everyone knows Manhattan's half empty these days as well, so a little different than Australia.
Certainly. So I look at it, this whole reindustrialization of the United States from which appears to be an antithesis of what globalization was or is. So this protectionist mentality, as is getting traction overall, I mean, I don't want to get into politics, but that's what it is, in fact, at the end of the day. So the US government had probably had it enough of the issues in terms of the industrialization and the supply chain issues as we see. So we all know, like, even from our construction perspective too, so many of our products are built across the world, and they're assembled in different ways in different places, and they come to us in different shapes and forms, and then reassembled locally. Even before being brought to the site, there is some sort of reassembly done. So it's a very complex process that we and that we had got ourselves entangled in. So COVID exposed that, obviously, and the previous government had their own take on this issue too. Because of the way they saw what's good for United States. So one of the Made in America was one of the first thing that we had in a while, which started bringing industry back to the United States. So that is having an impact, and we're seeing that impact right now in terms of the actual reindustrialization, and green economy is one of the bright spot in that fact. That is taking a lead. Technology and the green economy is the theme from in that industrialization process. So we are realigning our supply chain locally. We are in the United States, and that's happening, and that's where these new projects are coming online. We saw the rise in retail, as Niall mentioned, online, and that is the United States has tackled it very well. We might have overbuilt as well somehow on the warehouse sector, and the reason I mention this is because where Amazon being one of the leading indicators and the market leaders in that segue, they have retracted back. They are scaling back on their new construction. They have built those facilities, but like large warehouse and a facilitation where all this e-commerce is done on a regional basis. They have these big regional hubs as well. So they have scaled those back as well. And this trend of warehouse had been going on since, I'd say, in 2010. And you could see it with the advent and improvement in technology, this warehouse segment had been in play. Now coming back to the industrial side again, we had the United States government had some pieces of legislation, as I mentioned earlier too, like the chip, building the chips, semiconductors in the United States. That is one of the big ones that the government is planning on doing, and those projects are already on the ground as well. Probably, I'd say California had been doing that very well on that end. Data centers is one of the bright spot on the commercial real estate side. Likewise, your manufacturing in Ohio region, that is happening too. Likewise, I'd mentioned the North America, like the South American side too. So similar infrastructure projects are happening there too. And the industrialization, which, Martin, you might agree or disagree with me, but the Rust Belt that around the United States took a lot of jobs from the United States to Canada, per se, on the auto side, and to Mexico too. So now we're seeing the same trend on the Mexico. Most recently, like the Tesla, they announced a huge gigafactory in Mexico, right across the border from Texas. So combine this our overall regional industrialization impact from a NAFTA perspective, even if you look at it from that end, that is happening. These three economies are trying to intertwine. They are intertwined, but they are trying to more streamline them. But the United States, those sectors there will be a continued investment, and there will be smart development. It won't be like we might not see those old jobs of the older days of manufacturing, but it will be geared towards this new economy as we are looking at right now.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the green economy plays out if you start to look at it in terms of politics, especially with the southern red states declaring that global warming doesn't happen in the south of the US anymore. So, and then we've got our favorite ex-president. We're going to have flying cars soon too. So we'll have to see how this all plays out. So before we get into politics, then I get in trouble and I get yelled at by Johannes. We'll move on. So let's quickly do a roundtable on cost factors in the regions, and then what's big, small, what's the impact, what you've seen? And a few of the examples we're talking about is cost escalation, supply chain, labor shortage, pandemic issues. We've spoken about policy issues, demand, housing affordability. We'd had a lot of discussion before we started this session about condo or built for sale and maintaining value, purchase, getting loans, all of that sort of stuff, rental, built to rental. So it's kind of a big round robin topic, but if you throw all that into a bucket and you picked a few things that are going to have a big impact, the stuff that's going to be small, where do you think we're looking at? And Faris, if you want to go first.
Absolutely. So I'd say material prices and wages. Those are the two factors in terms of the cost that have impacted us in the past too, and we might see them again. Would we see the double digits inflation escalation, I'd say, in construction that we saw in the last year or two? Obviously not. We are well past that stage. Hopefully, I'm hoping it's going to get better, and we are all pointing towards that it is going to be better because of the material price with the slowing demand somehow as it's anticipated, particularly on some of the key materials, lumber and steel per se. Those are pointing towards lower costs right now, and the futures are projected to be lower too in 2023 and well into 2024 as well. And it's again supply and demand side too. But however, some international events might have some implications on us as well. Wages is the second one. Wages had been increasing, so we might be seeing some additional increases, which is anticipated in 2023, keeping up with inflation. And those union rates are opening up by the middle of the 2023. So we might see some addition around 4.5% to 5% increases in the labor costs. But the overall, those are the two. Then the lead times again is still an issue. Lead times across the board we are seeing in the United States, throughout the United States, wherever we are working in recent projects and the past ones that we had worked into. So supply chain issue is still an issue. The couple of major ones that we could see, MEP is still the major one continues to create headaches. But some of the people who had been hoarding these materials, hopefully that hoarding might not happen in 2023, because we had seen sites being within and around sites too, materials being hoarded or pre-bought, or we saw that activity, which we never saw that level of activity being, so that might have contributed somehow to that supply chain issue too. So with this little semblance to the market and some sanity hopefully prevailing, we will be dealing with this in a much better way in 2023. That's my hope.
So now we've addressed North America, which, as we always say, is the center of the universe. Niall, fancy taking the rest of the planet?
Yeah, look, a lot of those are similar sort of things. I think mindset is a little bit like a pendulum, and I do agree lead time is one of those big issues in regards to, but our mindset shifted from where we got very used to the just-in-time sort of solution in regards to it, and a move from that sort of a mindset of we had it down to a very, very tight schedule of when something actually arrived, to during the pandemic, a just in case sort of a mindset of buy an extra one just in case we might need it, which created its own issues in regards to the actual availability of product in market, where we're actually coming back a little bit now to where the supply is there. Again, picking up on what Ferris was also saying in relation to supply chain, major pieces of particular MEP for any type of a building is still an issue. A lot of that is as parts of the actual global, particularly China, is now starting to crank up. We're actually starting to see supply of product coming to sort of more normal times, but they still are quite long. In regards to the prices, in regards to probably the biggest spectre I see on the horizon is around the industrial relations. There is an expectation within the workforce that wage growth will match inflation, and people are very conscious about the fact that inflation is very high. Unions are reacting to that, and we could see a prolonged period in some of the economies, and I'm thinking more so a lot of Europe and the likes of Australia, not so much into the likes of Asia, where union activity is going to drive a lot of disruption, and in turn that will impact on the viability of a number of the delivery partners. So I think that insolvencies is going to be one of those things where we're actually going to see a large rise. And the issue is not necessarily with the main contractors, but the trade contractors who are used on a number of different projects with a number of different head contractors, and the flow-on effect of those, particularly if it is in the MEP sector, which accounts for a large portion of the cost of any building. That's probably the area that I'm sort of seeing as probably one of the big impact areas in regards to why escalation is still a little bit on the wages side of things going to be one of the things to keep an eye on. Material prices definitely are sort of coming under some control. There's still some areas that are problems. Glass, aluminium, that side of things seem to be a particular sore point at the moment. And then it's down to some particular items in relation to finishes. But a lot of that's to do with the cycle of where we are. And this is the same in all of the regions, where particular pain points may be around joinery at a particular part of the cycle, and then shifts to being, say, structural steel, which is something that we experienced in the beginning of last year, in particular in some areas, and then the shortage of timber, and even sort of very micro sort of issues in relation to it. The level of the Rhine River is causing a particular problem in the availability of CLT, because 5 of the 6 major plants for cross-laminated timber is in the Rhine Valley, and there's issues in relation to the availability of materials being brought in and out because of the level of the Rhine. Very small micro issue, and it'll cause a little problem during coming into the summer, but that has a major flow-on effect, and particularly as the proliferation of the desire around the green building. When people start going down this road and actually specifying a particular product, the availability of that and the ability of the industry to actually react to it is actually sort of one of those particular issues that raise. Look, for its varying things within the other sort of geos around the place, I think it's going to be a little bit of the customer base, the viability of that, and if we have little shocks through the economies, I think we have seen that in the tech industry, where there has been reasonable layoffs in a sector and in an industry that believed it was immune to all these particular things. They basically overhired, and then they're correcting that and sort of rebalancing what that workforce is. But that changes the demand in a particular area and also puts a little bit of fear within the market. So I think those are particular issues that are there. I also think that one of the things that is happening at the moment in a number of the geos is the drive for quality, and the government legislation around quality is causing a little bit of a steep learning curve for some of the contractors and is adding a cost to it. It shouldn't be something that's prolonged. It's going to be a smaller blip until we move across to build the business as usual. But it is an issue at the moment as people are learning to actually fulfill their new obligations in particular areas. It's no different, as I said, I touched on earlier on about the flow-on effect of what's happened out of Grenfell. We've had similar issues here in relation to building quality within Australia, particularly as we go back into the resi sector. But that's also been a strong issue throughout the whole lot of Europe, and as I said earlier on, in Asia. And all we have to do is look at the unfortunate instances of what's happened in Turkey on the back of the earthquakes, and what's that meant for actually buildings that were supposed to be earthquake-proof. Quality is going to be one of those things that is really driven into, and it will have a change to cost when people are comparing what something cost me in the previous time to now. But what they're failing is that they're actually the difference in the quality of the product is actually quite dramatic.
Yeah, and I think
I might add something to what Nal just said. We're looking at this circular economy right now as we speak in general. And that means, like, from cradle to grave concept that we had earlier, now we are cradle to cradle concept that we are in this new economy as we're seeing. So a lot of these companies that are manufacturing these products, they are reporting these greenhouse emissions and their overall carbon footprints, even on their products that they are selling right now. I'm talking construction industry particularly. And touching back on that same comment that Marlon, you made about that New York, that I should touch a little bit about that local law 97 that had come into play. So in US, from US perspective, California and New York and Washington states, these are three most, I'd say, vocal, and they are the leaders in general. Even going back to the building code era when we had New York was the one that initiated the building codes in general. So coming back to the point of what they're trying to achieve is they reduce the carbon footprint of the building. So this is local law 97, and from a New York perspective would impact approximately 25% of the buildings by 2024. And after that, they will be penalized significant amounts, keeping in view your building size as well. So the ranges, it could range over $1 million fine for a building per se. And that industry is grappling already with these pandemic issues. And now they have been having issues in the past with local law, which is another thing with the facades. Whoever has been to New York City, you might have seen those scaffolds around town. Those are basically to protect you from the facades, which are crumbling, basically. So the intent is to combine these two laws together for the going forward. But the intent is to have the carbon neutral city per se by 2050. So those targets, I mean, they are targets. They will or will not be achieved. We will see. But these are good positive impacts. The other thing is the resilience as well. Like around the U.S. coastal belt, where we have a lot of cities and a lot of construction. Already construction is happening, and already we have a huge portfolio of across the board, commercial, residential, you name it. I mean, across the board, we have huge presence around our coastal belt. So this resilience and the city is to be resilient to those natural impacts and the climate change effects that we are seeing. One recent example is the Lower Manhattan, as we know right now. We have this new seawall being built around the Wall Street area, Lower Manhattan area. This is something which is new to the city too. So yes, these are huge investments as well. These are not simple investments, and we have to protect our infrastructure against these natural calamities. Recently, we had a huge hurricane impact in Florida. And believe it or not, like this resilient project that I mentioned about Lower Manhattan, this was from 2012 hurricane. So it took us 10, 12 years to come to break the ground on these projects. from the event than it happened. And this is to protect New York City. Now we are talking Florida, we are talking Louisiana's, Texas, and Florida itself. So these all coastal belt, particularly on the Gulf of Mexico side, and also on our the Pacific side is calmer, but the rest of the areas they need large investments. Things are happening, but at a very slower pace. But those are some of the impacts that we are seeing.
So I think rather than the next question, this actually segues what you've been both talking about. Because you've both mentioned, Niall's mentioned liquidity and you mentioned the CLT story, which ties into the ESG. So if you put this together, we have seen major challenges with the move over to sustainability. For example, if we get very specific heat pumps, so certainly energy efficiency heat pumps, largely produced in the US, but Europeans buy them, Canadians buy them, they're sold all over the world. Now, sustainability standards have increased, there's a shortage of them. We're seeing a shift over to CLT because it's an easy solution to zero carbon, but what's the manufacturing capability? So as we start to look at the calamities you mentioned as well, earthquakes, obviously very common in the US as well, as we've just seen the horrible one in Turkey. Isn't all that going to cost a hell of a lot of money? Because the supply chain is not designed to hit any of these ESG standards or deal with these calamities and massive infrastructure projects. So if the whole world decided to move over to the ESG tomorrow, like full on zero carbon, and everyone went at the same time, and everyone decided to deal with every calamity that could happen because of cost, wouldn't that just crash the construction market? Is that a bad thing for cost? And can we even adapt to cope with that?
I think you're right. We can't all do everything all at the one time. It'll just crash it all. When we talk about natural disasters and calamities in regards to, unfortunately, I'm in a region where we regularly go through cycles of this. And so over the last, recent years, we went from having major bushfires with, on the scale that most people can't comprehend in relation to it, where just, we have fires here where they are the size of countries. It's a sheer scale is unbelievable. And then we follow that with floods, and we have troubled pandemic in between. If we have a look at, say, the earthquake in Wellington as an example of the reaction in regards to what that has meant, that has dragged on for well over 12, 14 years since the event. And they're still having struggles in regards to actually replacing damaged product in regards to, we're going to have the same thing here, where in the northern rivers of New South Wales, towns have been just wiped out, where there was levees built in the past, and they were just absolutely swamped in regards to it. That's a major issue for us, and it's an area that we're actually active in at the moment in the rebuilding of those particular communities. But for a number of those people, they're just going to actually have the choice of either being wiped out financially, or if not, trying to rebuild and actually try and look to see what can actually be done. If that happened all the way around the world, yes, we would crash it. And we are seeing a little bit of that in regards to the activity within the linear infrastructure, say around roads, tunnels, and rail, that the demand for particular product in there, be it pieces of equipment like tunnel boring machines or road headers, is such that there isn't any available. And even if it's down to we get very specific about things like large diameter piling rigs, the demand for those is setting that for the rest of 2023, there's some of those particular things are just not available, which is impacting on design. That's a common thing that's happening not only here, but in Australia, but also throughout Asia, where we're seeing, rail and infrastructure projects in the likes of Singapore or Thailand, in Korea, even in the likes of Vietnam. And the actual available resources are very, very poor. Like we get into aviation is one of those great areas to talk about, because pre-pandemic, the move was to smaller, longer distance jets, and that was changing the configuration at airports. Post-pandemic, we've decided that we actually need all those larger capacities, so we're actually putting things back in again to handle the bigger jets. Yes, I think to your point, Marlon, we have to be very careful that if we're trying to do too much too quickly, will crash it all, make it totally unaffordable, and prices will actually blow out beyond all belief. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think common sense tells me that we work in an industry and we interact with an economy that knows it can't do everything all together, all at the same time. So I don't see that as really a particular issue. It is a possibility, but an unlikely one.
Is it not a risk because of politics? And again, you see that across Europe, and you definitely see it in the US. I mean, the US is committed to crazy levels of infrastructure spending that they can't possibly achieve because they've underspent for so long. And I know we've had discussions in this before. I mean, the globe has been underspending on keeping infrastructure up forever. And I think the Western countries are even worse at it than anywhere else. And everyone's been putting everything off. So the big question is, are all these issues going to combine at the same time? And that's where I believe the risk could be that the government tries to do something because they have to, and the timing's just all wrong. And before we know it, we're in double-digit escalation everywhere.
Look, the analogy of government spending in particular against and offsetting and trying to control inflation, it's government spending, and if they keep on spending uncontrollably, is like putting your foot on the gas at the same time as having your other foot on the brake, which is the interest rate rises. So it's a question of which is going to win. Eventually, and what we are seeing in some particular things is that escalation is driving to such a point that it's killing a number of these infrastructure projects because the cost of delivery is actually starting to get way too high, and it's actually changing a number of the perspectives. It could see the rise of public-private partnerships to being a higher usage. That, particularly in Europe, we remember that a lot of PPP started in the UK, and it fell out of favour a little bit, but they're actually coming back because government knows that it can't actually has the other problem. It really wants to deliver all this infrastructure. It knows it's been underspending, but it also has the spectre of leaving the next generation with an unsustainable amount of debt. And that is something that people are conscious of. So I think we'd see a political cycle where I think it's seen in the US, where you'll see from one extreme to the other, where if they go down too aggressively into a spend cycle, the money has to come from somewhere. And so it'll either cause taxes will rise, or they'll actually push the debt out to being further down the road. And if you look at the level of indebtedness to GDP, a lot of the European countries are still well over 100%. We're in Australia, we're in a lucky situation where, albeit that it's a war cry in the economy, our level of debt is actually quite low to GDP compared to the rest of the world. So we have a luxury of, we could actually afford to take on a little bit more debt, but that's very politically unpalatable, is about the nicest way of putting it. And it's a sure way to probably cause, in tight elections, it's a sure way to actually cost you the election by actually creating too much in regards to it. So I think, again, a little bit of the pendulum, it swung a little bit and it had to catch up. And I think, I read about what's happened in the US, and first, and probably you could point to that, the level of spend in infrastructure has got to rise. We had that in Australia, where we did not spend for a very long time in the major cities. We're catching up on all that, both social and linear. But it'll actually get to a point where we've delivered a large portion of it, and we'll go back to a sort of a more sustainable level of activity in that area.
No, coming to Marlin's point about the infrastructure spending and overall the infrastructure, I look at it, it's a two-pronged issue. One, we have pushed the can too far too. We all knew that what is priority at home rather than priorities across the world, that the US has taken over that particular role. So that is an issue too that keeps coming back, and we go through these vicious cycles, which keeps bringing. But again, the issue still remains. However, some positive things have happened here. The Infrastructure Act of 2022, although you're right, the amount of spending and the time frame that money needs to be spent, it's up in the air. The final budgets haven't been fully finalized, but it still is a work in progress. But again, huge monies are earmarked for maintaining. First of all, maintenance is the first issue. Building the new one which is the requirement too, is the secondary. So and it covers roads, bridges, tunnels, even your public housing sector too. Just to point one small example, like in New York City, NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, is one of the largest landlords per se in the city. So they are behind by 35 billion as of last year in terms of just the regular upkeep. And those buildings were pre-60, post-60, but definitely pre-80, pre-1980s. So this is, and then again, our airports, just to give you another example, recently, JFK Airport, it's being upgraded right now, which is, and I remember a while back in 2010, that planning process was when it was announced. So it took us 12 years to come to it. Likewise, the buildings that we built in the Manhattan after that 9/11 event, those buildings it took them so much longer to build those even. So deliverance is one aspect, cost side is the other aspect, and then it's beyond control. And then another bridge, one other bridge I'll mention to you, there's a Tappan Zee Bridge, which connects. It was one of the large projects, and it doubled the cost almost as of last 2 years when it was finally handed. And there's still some parts of it are in construction still. So infrastructure spending is one issue, but the controlling that process and managing that process is another issue too. And now we are earmarking X number of dollars to be spent in X number of years, which is a short span of time to rebuild and spend this money to somehow supplement the loss in the, I'd say, private sector, which because of the crisis and the inflation slash the Fed's policy that we are seeing right now. The other thing is so that's one of the comments that I wanted to make. The other one is the insurance industry, which is underpinning a lot of these coastal facilities, coastal communities per se. That is under stress as well right now. And we do, as Altus as a group, we do replacement cost studies for large groups, and we manage those aspects of those projects as those components and that cost factor. And there's a debate around that too. How much could they afford? Recently, this Florida, we had a huge hurricane that hit us, and now the insurance industry. The news that are coming. I mean, it's a mixed news, but those obligations are not being met right now, and people are left at the mercy of the Mother Nature per se. So it's a lot of challenges that are on both the spending side and on the planning side, and also on the management side too. So it needs to be controlled somehow, and the way to go forward is to work more with private sector, as Niall mentioned, like. Private sector brings a lot of efficiencies to the system. However, the issue with this infrastructure spending is it's going to be mostly unionized labor too as well. So some of the small shops, they're complaining already that how are we going to match up because we're going to be left out in that process too. So it will be interesting. Will we be looking at the same old? Are we going to be moving forward by learning lessons from what we have done already? That's my take on it.
Well, you fellas spoke way too much, so now we're running really out of time. So we do have one final question, but you have to be super quick. So what is your prediction for further cost escalation in the regions? Are we going lower, higher, increase? Where are we heading? Faris, you go first, but you got to be real quick.
Absolutely. So what we're seeing for the 2023, we're not going to go back to the pre-pandemic level, obviously. So across the board, the common consensus is approximately 3.5% to 5% increases we anticipate in 2023. That's my take.
Where are you heading, Niall?
Bit of a mixed bag in regards to it. It's not going down. That's the first thing I have to say. Depending on the sectors, we could see anything, in around in the industrial and commercial sectors where there's a bit more desire. I think that will be a little bit in the lower scale, sort of like the 4 to 5%. The other areas where there's either lack of competition or just a desire for market. I think they'll be up into the, between the 5 and the 8s, depending on what they are. But I do think that as we move into 2024, that will start drifting back down and come back to a more sustainable 3 to 4s. Europe, it's a bit of a mixed bag again. I think because of issues in regards to it in the mainland Europe, I think we'll see escalation still creeping along in those comparable sort of like the 5% for this year, backing off UK, Ireland. I think that'll be coming off a higher. There's a lot higher in level of escalation in those two countries, but I think they're much more likely to hit a cliff, and I think that they'll actually come down quite dramatically, albeit that's 2024 before we see anything like that.
That's the quickest either of you have answered any question. I'm impressed. So now we did originally save 10 minutes or so for questions, but I think that's gone out the window right now. So maybe we'll just knock out 2 and you guys can throw a quick opinion again. So someone's recognized that it's all been doom and gloom. You and Faris are depressing the hell out of us. So how about throwing a positive, proactive approach we can recommend people to deal with the construction challenges we see over the next couple of years? Niall, do you want to throw it out first?
Yeah, sure. I think the outlook is within the industry. The outlook is good. I think the changes within what we're doing around quality is going to actually drive us to building better product. I think the changes in technology that is going to come in relation to trying to actually get some of our carbon contributions down in regards to what we're actually delivering as a building and how it operates is going to also be a growth area. And I think as we understand these more and the technologies come on, I think that we'll see a wider adoption of that, and that'll come right the way across into your homes in regards to it. So it's an area of growth. It's an area I think that we'll actually see a lot of activity, and I think we'll see actually some great scale. And I look at what I point in regards to that is particularly around the solar side of things. We look at actually how cost-effective solar has become in regards to it across the last 5 to 10 years. Now it's actually adopted widely on most buildings, and particularly in the industrial sector. Like it's a huge positive story that we actually can talk about in relation to it, and the use of alternative materials. I think they're the things we have that are going to come, and I think a bit of sensibility in relation to what we're actually trying to achieve from some of the legislative changes in regards to what we're actually doing with the actual sustainability is going to be positive in the economy.
So Faris, what's your positive proactive approach? No negativity allowed.
Not at all. Absolutely. So the healthy thing is, like, the architects and contractors, they have a huge, they have a decent backlog. Plus, we are also looking at the completion of the projects, which is a positive thing that is going to keep everyone busy well into 2023 and 2024 with the more flexible designs, timing and delivery schedules being negotiated early on would definitely help. And then the double digits are behind us, as we said. So it's a positive news in a way. And it's going to definitely add to the bottom line of the contractors as well, and the subs as well, and in the industry in general. So we might see some definitely better margins as well due to better planning and the less pressure that was previously faced in terms of deliverance and all the other aspects that are related to it. Reconstruction work is steadily increasing as well. Post-pandemic, a lot of healthcare facilities and the overall reconstruction market in the retail too, for example, to comply to the pandemic-related issues that we saw. So we are resolving those, and MEP is a bright spot too in the healthcare sector, because they intend to improve the indoor air quality of those facilities. Likewise, institutionals as well as educational facilities as well. So it's a positive news. I'm positive because of the demand. Again, I'm saying demand is there. Issues are there definitely, but they are manageable. And the more better planning you do, pre-planning you do, the more involved you are with the teams and suppliers right from the onset before bringing them on board would definitely add to the bottom line of everyone.
I think everyone likes the sound of increased margins. If our CEO's listening, he's going to be happy with that. And maybe the expectations from us might be a bit higher now that might not be good. So I'll do one last question. I think, Niall, if you're comfortable answering it, it's more focused towards you. If China and, say, India have a housing issue or even a crash, what could that do to the global market? Would there be an impact outside of those regions?
Definitely. Like we've seen the issues in regards to, particularly say with China and Evergrande, as one of the largest, basically residential developers. The population in a number of these particular countries has an addiction, I suppose is the best way of saying it, in relation to the desire around property. And when you look at actually how much of the wealth of the individual is tied up within property in Asia, it can be up to 80%, 85%. You look at that compared to sort of some of the Western development economies, and it's more normal to be in around the 50%, or if not less. What's the flow-on effect for the rest of the economies around the world? China is still one of the biggest producers of product. If there's a major crash within the property market within China, it will have a flow-on effect right the way across its industry, and it's basically that will spread out across the rest of the world in regards to, again, we're having issues in regards to supply chain and surety of delivery. Will it happen? Well, no, the Chinese government is a very involved government. It's engaged right the way through every level of the economy. So they'll actually probably take steps to do it, but again, it'll cost them. So that we may see the China sort of growth sort of comes back off a little bit. I think one of the other things that is worth mentioning is that China's influence in the developing economies, not only within our region, but throughout the whole globe, is quite prolific in its Belt and Road sort of policies in regards to what it's trying to do, and that is actually sort of bringing along a bit of activity within it. I think India's influence will start to rise. I know that Australia is currently trying to negotiate an enhanced sort of free trade deal with India, and I think that just from its actual sheer population and the size of the economy that is there, any sort of a hiccup to that'll have a flow-on effect to the rest of the world. But you'd have to look at that and see that that's actually a great potential. So even if China does go a little bit down, India could actually fill that void quite successfully. So there's a lot of things that are actually playing in region. India, though, has also got a similar problem in relation to its actual level of exposure to the residential market. So either of those two economies, if they actually get into a bubble situation that bursts, that could have a serious flow-on effect for what we're actually seeing in our supply chains again around the world.
Perfect. So thank you to everybody for attending the webinar today, especially those that managed to survive through to the end. I know I'm tired, but as we mentioned at the start, we're sharing a copy of the recording after today's webinar. Also, if you want signed pictures of myself, Faris, or Niall, they can be available for a small charge also. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.